Jake's life was shattered when his beloved dog Max went missing. Desperate and heartbroken, he searched endlessly, never giving up hope. But what he never expected was the day he found a dying puppy on the street. After saving it, a DNA test revealed something that would change everything. This puppy was Max's baby. A bond formed that neither time nor distance could break. Now, Jake must face a dark underworld of illegal breeding and stolen pets to uncover the truth, save his dog's legacy, and protect countless others from the same fate. Will he succeed? Jake walked down the quiet street, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his jacket. It had been a rough few weeks since Max, his golden retriever, had disappeared without a trace. The house felt emptier, and his heart heavier with each passing day. He could still remember Max's wagging tail, the way he'd always nudge Jake's hand when he wanted attention. Max had been more than a dog. He was family. Today, the weather was colder than usual, with a biting wind cutting through the air. Jake quickened his pace, hoping the chill would somehow numb the pain of losing Max. But as he walked past the alleyway near the old bakery, something caught his eye. A small whimpering sound echoed from the shadows. Jake stopped, confused. It wasn't the usual street noises, but something softer, more desperate. His heart sank as he turned toward the alley. There, in the damp corner, lay a tiny puppy, its fur matted and soaked, its ribs visible through the thin layer of fur. The pup's eyes were barely open, and it looked like it was struggling to breathe. Without thinking, Jake dropped to his knees and gently scooped up the trembling creature. His heart broke at the sight of the frail little animal in his arms. "What happened to you?" he muttered softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The puppy let out a soft whimper, its body limp in Jake's arms. He could feel the warmth of its tiny heartbeat, but it was weak. Jake's mind raced. Should he call the shelter? Should he take it to a vet? He didn't have time to think about it. He just knew he couldn't leave the puppy here to die alone. He stood up, clutching the little dog close to his chest. As he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was somehow fate. The puppy, though sick and weak, felt strangely familiar, like Max in some way. But how could that be? Max was gone. Shaking the thought from his mind, Jake decided to drive straight to the vet. The puppy needed help, and he wasn't about to stand by and watch it suffer. The vet's office smelled of antiseptic and disinfectant. Jake sat in the waiting room, the tiny puppy wrapped in a towel on his lap. The poor thing barely moved, its breathing shallow and erratic. The waiting room was empty except for a few tired-looking plants in the corners, but Jake couldn't keep his mind from racing. He stared at the puppy, wondering how something so small could seem so helpless. Moments later, the vet, a tall woman with kind eyes named Dr. Mallory, entered the room. She looked at Jake and the puppy, her gaze immediately softening. "Let me take a look at him," she said gently, reaching out to take the little creature into her hands. Jake stood up and followed her into the examination room, unable to look away from the puppy's frail form. Dr. Mallory placed the puppy on the table and began examining it carefully, her hands moving with professional precision. She looked at Jake, her face a mixture of concern and frustration. "Poor thing," she said softly. "It's in really bad shape. It looks like it hasn't been fed properly for a while, and there are some signs of infection. If we don't act fast, it might not survive." Jake's heart sank. He couldn't bear the thought of losing the puppy so soon after finding it. "Can you save it?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "I'll do my best, but it's going to take time. I'll put him on an IV drip and give him some medication to stabilize him," Dr. Mallory explained. Jake nodded. He didn't know why he felt so strongly for this puppy. Maybe it was because it reminded him of Max, or maybe because he couldn't stand the idea of another life slipping through his fingers. He didn't care about the how or the why. He just knew he had to try. The next few days were tense. Jake visited the vet every morning and evening, watching as the little puppy slowly regained some strength. It started eating small amounts of food and even managed to stand on its own, though it still wasn't able to walk properly. But Jake noticed something. As the puppy became stronger, it began to act more like Max had. It would follow him around the room, curl up at his feet, and whine when he left. Jake had a hard time explaining it, but he started to feel like this puppy was connected to Max in some way. It couldn't be, could it? The idea seemed too strange, too impossible. But the more time he spent with the puppy, the more the thought lingered in his mind. One afternoon, after a long day at work, Jake sat down with the puppy in his lap. He'd named it Milo, an odd name, but it felt right. He stroked Milo's soft fur and gazed out the window, thinking of Max. "I don't know why you feel so familiar, but I'm glad I found you," Jake whispered, his voice breaking. Milo lifted his head, and for the first time, Jake saw something in the puppy's eyes, a glimmer of recognition, of understanding. It was as if the dog knew Jake's pain, as if it understood the longing he had for Max. A week passed, and while Milo was improving physically, Jake's curiosity only grew stronger. He began researching dog breeds, trying to find something that might explain the strange connection he felt. There was no way the puppy could be related to Max, right? But the thought gnawed at him. Finally, in a moment of desperation, Jake made the decision. He called the vet and asked about a DNA test. "Is there any way to test if this puppy is related to my dog?" Jake asked, his voice unsure. Dr. Mallory didn't hesitate. "We can do that. It's not something we usually do for rescued animals, but I can arrange for the test." Jake agreed, and a few days later, he received the results. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope. The test had been completed, and the results were as shocking as they were clear. The letter from the lab confirmed what Jake had only dared to hope. The puppy, Milo, was not just any dog, it was Max's offspring. Jake's mind raced. Max had been missing for over a year, and the idea that this puppy could be his son was overwhelming. He read the results again, just to make sure he wasn't seeing things. There it was, black and white. Milo's DNA matched Max's perfectly. But how had it happened? And why was the puppy abandoned, barely alive in the alley? Jake had so many questions, but no answers. One thing was certain, though. This puppy wasn't just a random rescue. It was Max's legacy. The revelation hit Jake hard. He felt a surge of guilt and confusion. Had Max been stolen? Had the people who took him bred him for profit? And why had they left Milo to die? These were questions that Jake couldn't ignore. With Milo now a part of his life, Jake couldn't just sit idly by. He had to find out what had happened to Max and make sure Milo had a better future. Jake started digging into dog trafficking rings in the area, desperate to find answers. He reached out to animal rights groups and rescue organizations, sharing his story and hoping for leads. It didn't take long for him to discover that his worst fears might be true. There were rumors of stolen dogs being bred and sold illegally, and Jake's heart sank. Could Max have been part of that? Jake wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was clear. His search for answers had only just begun. Jake knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, and that help came in the form of Mia, an animal rights activist he met through an online forum dedicated to rescuing lost and stolen dogs. Mia was determined, passionate, and fearless. The moment she heard Jake's story, she jumped at the opportunity to assist him. Mia and Jake met at a local coffee shop, exchanging notes and theories. Mia's experience in investigating illegal pet trade rings gave her insight into the dark side of the dog rescue world. "If there's one thing I've learned," Mia said, "it's that these people will go to great lengths to hide what they're doing. But we have to dig deeper." Their investigation led them to a nearby animal shelter that had a history of questionable practices. Both of them were suspicious, especially when they discovered that the shelter had been involved in several high-profile dog adoptions that seemed too good to be true. They spent the next few days shadowing the shelter's operations, trying to find out more about how dogs were being handled. It didn't take long before they realized something was off. The shelter had several records of missing dogs, some of which seemed eerily connected to the area Jake had been searching in. Jake and Mia dug deeper, interviewing former employees of the shelter and looking for any trace of Max's involvement. One afternoon, they found an old adoption log tucked away in the back office. There it was, Max's name listed under a batch of dogs adopted months before his disappearance. Milo, Jake muttered under his breath, his heart racing. It's connected. I know it. Mia examined the log with interest. This doesn't make sense, she said, flipping through the pages. Max could have been sold to someone, but the records here, they don't add up. Someone is covering their tracks. The two spent the next few weeks collecting evidence, snapshots of shady transactions and names that cropped up again and again. The more they uncovered, the more they realized this was no ordinary pet theft ring. It was a well-organized network that involved shelter workers, breeders, and people who trafficked dogs for profit. Things started to heat up. One evening, while Jake and Mia were staking out the shelter, they witnessed a suspicious exchange between one of the shelter workers and a man who looked out of place. He was holding a puppy in his arms, and the shelter worker handed him a large envelope filled with cash. Jake's pulse quickened. "Did you see that? That's definitely not normal," he said, his voice barely a whisper. They followed the man from a safe distance, watching as he entered a run-down building on the outskirts of town. Jake and Mia exchanged a glance. They were onto something big, but they had to be careful. The people behind this operation were dangerous, and they had already proven they weren't afraid to get violent to protect their business. With mounting evidence, Jake and Mia reached a turning point. They discovered the headquarters of the illegal operation, an old warehouse that had been converted into a breeding facility. They were horrified to find dozens of dogs crammed into small cages, many of them suffering from neglect and malnutrition. They immediately called the authorities, but the warehouse was locked up tight. Mia, determined to save the animals, broke into the building with Jake by her side. Inside, they found cages filled with puppies. Some of them were Max's siblings. The sight was both heartbreaking and maddening. Jake took a deep breath, looking around at the miserable animals. "We have to get them out of here," he said, his voice hard. "We can't let them suffer like this." The police arrived just in time to arrest the people responsible for the illegal breeding operation. Jake and Mia stood by, watching as the criminals were taken away in handcuffs. The dogs were finally being freed from their cages, but it wasn't over yet. They still had to find Max. One of the arrested men, a former employee of the shelter, hinted at the existence of an underground network of people who sold dogs on the black market. But he didn't know much about Max's whereabouts. "Your dog's long gone," he muttered, eyes filled with malice. "You'll never find him." The breakthrough was bittersweet. While many of the stolen dogs were rescued, there was still no sign of Max. Jake felt lost, unsure where to turn next. He spent countless nights searching through records, making phone calls, and chasing dead ends. The trail had gone cold. Milo, however, was thriving. As the days passed, Jake grew even more attached to the little puppy who had been through so much. It felt like Max was still with him, in some form. Jake's love for Milo grew stronger, and he became more protective of him, even though the search for Max was still ongoing. Just as Jake was starting to lose hope, Mia received an anonymous tip. It led them to an upscale neighborhood outside the city where a high-profile couple had recently adopted a dog from the shelter. Jake's heart raced as he realized this couple could be involved in Max's disappearance. They paid the couple a visit under the guise of asking about their new pet. To their shock, the dog they were shown had a striking resemblance to Max. It wasn't Max, but it was enough to confirm that this was part of the same operation. As Jake and Mia dug deeper, they discovered that Max had been sold to this couple after being taken from the shelter. They traced the dog's adoption records and eventually found the couple's address. After months of searching, Jake was finally close to finding his beloved dog. When they arrived at the couple's mansion, Jake was filled with a mix of excitement and dread. The couple greeted them warmly, offering coffee and small talk. But Jake's mind was focused solely on Max. "Can we see the dog?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. The couple led them to the backyard, where a large doghouse stood. As they opened the gate, Jake froze. There, lying in the sun, was Max, or at least someone who looked just like him. It was the same size, the same coat, and the same eyes. But when the dog turned and looked at Jake, a small part of him knew it wasn't Max. The dog had been through too much. It was a shadow of what Max had been. Jake's heart broke. His Max wasn't there. Back at the hotel, Jake sat with the adoption records in hand, trying to make sense of the puzzle. Mia had suggested they dig deeper into the couple's history. Maybe there was something they were missing. After an hour of searching through old records, they discovered that the couple had connections to a well-known breeder who had ties to the illegal pet trade. "Look at this," Mia said, pointing to an old contact sheet. "This breeder worked closely with the shelter that Max was originally adopted from. I think we're looking at a much bigger operation than we thought." Jake felt a spark of hope. This could be the lead they needed to find Max. They made plans to visit the breeder's farm in the morning. The following day, Jake and Mia arrived at the breeder's farm, a sprawling property on the outskirts of town. It looked peaceful from the outside, with well-maintained gardens and a few horses grazing in the field. But something about it didn't sit right with Jake. They were greeted by a man named Henry, a middle-aged, well-dressed individual who welcomed them with open arms. He offered them a tour of his property, showing them rows of well-kept dog kennels. "These dogs are prized," Henry boasted. "We breed only the finest. We've been at this for years. You should see some of the pedigrees we have." Jake's stomach turned. He had a gut feeling that Henry was hiding something. While Mia distracted him with questions about the breeding process, Jake slipped away to investigate. He found a small, hidden section of the farm where several dogs were kept in poor conditions. His heart sank. This was where the stolen dogs were being hidden. As Jake was about to snap pictures of the conditions, Henry appeared out of nowhere, his expression turning cold. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. Jake froze, his mind racing. I was just looking around," he stammered. "Looking around for what?" Henry pressed, stepping closer. "If you want to leave in one piece, I suggest you walk away now." Jake backed away, realizing the situation was escalating quickly. He managed to slip past Henry and run back to the car, where Mia was waiting. Their hearts were pounding, but they had seen enough. They had to get the authorities involved now. The next few days were a blur. With the evidence they had gathered, Jake and Mia worked tirelessly to contact the proper authorities. They provided detailed reports of the farm and its illegal activities. The police began their investigation, and a raid was planned. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Max was still out there, somewhere. As the raid approached, Jake's thoughts were consumed by the possibility of finally finding his dog. Meanwhile, Milo, now fully recovered, stayed by Jake's side, offering him comfort during the darkest days of uncertainty. The day of the raid finally arrived. Jake and Mia stood with the officers as they surrounded the farm. The air was tense, and Jake could feel the weight of the moment. The operation began with a bang, as officers broke down the gates to the breeding facility. Jake's heart raced as he watched them move in. The criminals were caught off guard, and several arrests were made. But it wasn't just Henry. The entire operation was much larger than they had thought. Dozens of dogs were rescued from the farm, but there was still no sign of Max. Jake and Mia decided to search the property one last time. With the authorities already combing through the farm, they focused on the hidden backrooms where Max could possibly be. After hours of searching, Jake stumbled across a familiar scent. Max's scent. His heart skipped a beat. There, locked in a small cage-like room, was a dog that immediately recognized Jake. It was Max, or at least what was left of him. Max had clearly been through hell, thin, scared, and covered in scars. But his eyes, those eyes were the same. Jake's tears flowed freely as he dropped to his knees. "Max, you're here," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Max limped toward him, letting out a soft whine. It was a reunion that Jake had dreamed of for so long. The days following the rescue were a mix of joy and sadness. Max, though physically broken, slowly regained his strength, much like the little puppy, Milo. Jake stayed by his side, nursing him back to health, offering him the comfort and love he deserved. Max's recovery was slow, but as he grew stronger, Jake noticed the bond between them only deepened. It was as if the pain of the past had somehow brought them even closer. The authorities continued their investigation, and many of the criminals behind the illegal breeding network were brought to justice. The operation was completely dismantled, and Jake could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Mia, who had become an invaluable ally throughout the entire ordeal, was proud of the work they had done together. But for Jake, the most important thing was that Max and Milo were safe. They had both become his family, his new beginning. With the illegal breeding operation shut down and the criminals behind bars, Jake felt a deep sense of satisfaction. However, there was more work to be done. He couldn't shake the feeling that the rescue effort had just scratched the surface of a much larger issue. There were still so many dogs out there suffering, and Jake was determined to make a difference. Mia had become an invaluable part of Jake's life, not just as a friend, but also as a partner in the fight for animal rights. Together, they founded an organization dedicated to rescuing lost and stolen dogs and raising awareness about animal cruelty. They called it Paws for Justice. Every day was an opportunity to help more animals, and soon the small group they had started grew into a movement. They received donations from all over the country, and local volunteers joined the cause. Max and Milo became the face of the organization, with their story inspiring countless others to get involved. As the Paws for Justice organization gained momentum, Jake and Mia appeared on local news stations and participated in interviews to raise awareness about the dangers of illegal dog trafficking. Their story of rescue and hope touched the hearts of many. People reached out, sharing their own stories of missing pets and offering support for the cause. For Jake, the work wasn't just about rescuing animals. It was about healing. His bond with Max had brought him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years, and now helping others was a way to keep that peace alive. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future for countless animals who still needed help. Despite the success of Paws for Justice, not every day was easy. Jake and Mia faced challenges that tested their resolve. There were threats from people connected to the illegal dog trafficking network they had exposed, and sometimes it felt as though they were fighting a never-ending battle. One evening, as Jake sat at his desk sorting through new reports of stolen pets, he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. His hands trembled as he looked at the faces of the missing dogs. There were still so many out there. "I don't know how much longer we can do this," Jake muttered, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Max and Milo, sensing his distress, came over and lay beside him, offering their silent support. Mia, ever the optimist, knocked on the doorframe and smiled. "We'll keep going, Jake. For Max, for Milo, for every dog out there who doesn't have a voice. We've already saved so many. We can't stop now." Her words were a reminder of why they had started this journey in the first place. They had come so far, and they couldn't let fear stop them now. As the months passed, the Paws for Justice organization began to expand even further. Jake and Mia managed to secure funding to open a rescue facility where dogs could be rehabilitated and eventually adopted into loving homes. They partnered with veterinarians, dog trainers, and foster families to create a safe haven for the animals they rescued. The work was hard, but it was rewarding. Jake watched as dogs that had been abandoned or abused were transformed into happy, healthy pets. He couldn't help but feel proud of what they had accomplished. His journey with Max and Milo had come full circle. What had started as a search for a missing dog had grown into a mission to save so many more. With their increasing success, however, came new dangers. The people they had exposed were not easily forgotten, and some still held grudges. There were anonymous threats, and at times it felt like someone was always watching them. One evening, after closing up the rescue facility, Jake received a phone call from an unknown number. He answered it, his heart pounding. Think you've won, don't you? A voice said, full of venom. You won't be able to stop what's coming. Your precious pause for justice is just the beginning. You're going to regret this. The line went dead. Jake's stomach churned with fear, but he couldn't let it stop him. They were doing the right thing, and they couldn't let threats deter them from their mission. He informed Mia of the call, and together they beefed up security at the facility. With the security issues now under control, Jake felt confident that they were building a safe and reliable system to help animals. They brought in more volunteers, trained more people, and expanded their reach. Their work was starting to make a tangible difference in their community. Max and Milo had become beloved symbols of hope. Max, who had once been a victim, was now a therapy dog, helping children and adults cope with loss and trauma. Milo, ever the mischievous puppy, kept things light-hearted, reminding everyone that no matter how dark the world could be, there was always room for joy and love. One afternoon, as Jake sat in his office, he received a phone call from an animal shelter in another state. They had found a dog that looked remarkably like Max, but it had been chipped under a different name. Could it be another sibling of Max? Jake's heart raced. He had always wondered if there were other dogs out there who might be related to Max. This could be the answer to a question that had lingered in his mind for so long. Without hesitation, he arranged to meet the shelter and bring Max and Milo along for the journey. Jake arrived at the shelter, hopeful yet cautious. As they led him to the back, he saw the dog. It had the same soulful eyes, the same fur pattern, but something was different. This dog was older, scarred, and more timid. It didn't take long for Jake to recognize the unmistakable resemblance to Max. "This is incredible," Jake whispered as he kneeled down to meet the dog, who slowly walked toward him. "You're family, aren't you?" The dog cautiously sniffed him, and for a moment it was as if time stood still. Jake gently reached out and petted the dog's head, his heart swelling. This was Max's sibling, a survivor just like him. With the shelter's help, Jake and Mia took the dog in, naming him Jack. Max and Jack formed an immediate bond, as if they had known each other their entire lives. As Pause for Justice flourished, Jake found himself surrounded by an ever-growing community of like-minded people. The work was demanding, but it filled him with purpose. Max, Milo, and Jack had become the face of the organization, their stories of survival and recovery inspiring others to join the fight against animal cruelty. The rescue facility was buzzing with activity, volunteers working tirelessly to care for the dogs, veterinarians providing medical treatment, and trainers helping rehabilitate the more traumatized animals. The success stories began to pour in, one after another, as dogs once abandoned and forgotten found new homes. Jake, however, couldn't forget about the ones still out there. He received daily calls about missing dogs, and the cases kept piling up. While the success of Pause for Justice was heartwarming, the fight was far from over. One evening, Jake was in the middle of a meeting with Mia when his phone buzzed. It was another call from a concerned pet owner, someone whose dog had gone missing just a few days ago. The pet was a breed Jake recognized, one of the more expensive dogs often targeted by the illegal dog trafficking networks. He listened intently, taking down notes about the dog's last known location. This wasn't the first time they'd received a similar call. Jake and Mia knew that they had to act fast before more dogs became victims of these ruthless operations. "We can't let this go," Jake said as he hung up the phone. "It's a pattern. Someone's targeting families with expensive breeds." Mia nodded. "I agree. We've got to follow the trail, and this time we might be able to catch them red-handed." The next few days were tense. Jake and Mia worked alongside the police to track down the leads, mapping out where the stolen dogs were likely being taken. The trail led them to a city nearby, where reports of missing pets had been increasing. Jake's instincts told him that the person behind these thefts was more organized than he had initially thought. They were dealing with a large-scale operation, and it wasn't going to be easy to take down. "This is a dangerous game," Jake said to Mia one night as they planned their next move. "We're risking everything to expose this." "We don't have a choice," Mia replied. There are too many dogs out there who need us. With determination in their hearts, they set off the next day to track down the criminals who had been stealing pets. Jake and Mia arrived at a rundown warehouse at the outskirts of the city. They'd received a tip that it was being used as a hub for the stolen dogs, and the police had already staked out the location. But as they arrived, things didn't feel right. The area was eerily quiet, with only a few flickers of light coming from the warehouse windows. They knew the risk of getting caught, but they had come this far. "I don't like this," Jake whispered, looking around cautiously. Mia nodded. "Let's be careful. We'll stay in touch with the police." They approached the building slowly, trying to remain unnoticed. As they crept closer, the faint sounds of barking echoed from within. The closer they got, the clearer it became. There were dogs trapped inside. Before they could make their move, the door to the warehouse opened and several men stepped out. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he recognized one of them. He had seen him during the raid at the breeder's farm months ago. "Stay low," Jake hissed to Mia. They retreated into the shadows, watching as the men exchanged bags of money and goods before heading back inside. This was it, the break they had been waiting for. Jake and Mia knew they had to act quickly. The men inside were part of the same network that had stolen Max and countless other dogs. This was the moment they had been working toward. They quickly contacted the police, who were already on their way. But Jake didn't want to wait. He wanted to confront these men and make sure no more dogs were going to be hurt. Mia pulled Jake back as he started to move toward the warehouse. "Wait, we need backup. This is too dangerous." Jake hesitated, but then nodded. He understood the risk. The men inside were dangerous, and if they were caught off guard, things could go south fast. The sound of sirens grew louder, signaling that the police were close. Mia took out her phone and sent a quick text to update the team. The moment they arrived, they would move in together. The police arrived in full force, surrounding the warehouse. Jake, Mia, and the officers took their positions as quietly as possible. This was a delicate operation. If they moved too quickly, the criminals inside could try to flee, or worse, destroy evidence. Jake's hands were sweaty, his heart racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, the final confrontation that would either make or break everything they had worked for. With a loud crash, the police broke through the door. The criminals inside scrambled in panic as the officers swarmed in. It was chaos, shouting, scrambling, and the frantic barking of dogs echoing throughout the building. Jake and Mia ran toward the cages where the dogs were being kept. He recognized several of the breeds, purebred and valuable dogs that had likely been stolen from their families. He felt a surge of anger, but knew he had to stay focused. Mia opened the cages, freeing the dogs one by one. As Jake ran down the line, checking for Max, he finally found him. His heart skipped a beat. Max was there, and he was safe. The dog looked up at Jake with familiar eyes, tail wagging hesitantly. "Max," Jake whispered, tears filling his eyes. "I found you." Milo, who had been by Jake's side throughout the entire ordeal, barked excitedly as he recognized Max. The two dogs greeted each other, their bond unbroken by time or distance. With the criminals arrested and the dogs freed, the warehouse was cleared of all evidence. The police confiscated illegal documents and goods, which helped them track down more members of the operation. Jake and Mia knew this was a significant victory, but it was just one battle in a larger war against animal cruelty. Max, Milo, Jack, and the other rescued dogs were taken to the Paws for Justice facility, where they received medical care and attention. For Jake, the mission was still ongoing, but today there was a sense of peace. Max's recovery was swift, and he once again became a beacon of hope for the other dogs. The bond between Jake and Max had never been stronger. Jake continued to share their story, and their organization gained more supporters. Max became a therapy dog, helping people heal from trauma, just as Jake had. Milo, with his infectious energy, kept everyone smiling. Jack fit in seamlessly with the family, and together they were a symbol of resilience and hope. As Paws for Justice continued to grow, Jake and Mia began to explore ways to reach even more communities. They set up local chapters in different states and even expanded their outreach programs to educate the public about the dangers of illegal breeding and pet trafficking. Their efforts were slowly but surely changing the landscape for animals across the country. With every dog they saved, Jake felt a little more whole. Jake stood in front of the Paws for Justice building, looking out at the horizon. He was proud of how far they had come and knew that their work was far from over. He wasn't just a man who had rescued a dog. He was part of a movement that was saving lives. Max and Milo sat by his side, the sunlight gleaming in their fur as they watched the world around them. They had found each other again, and their journey was one of hope, healing, and love. As the sun set on another day, Jake whispered to his dogs, "We've come a long way, but we're just getting started."